welcome to the Council of Deans of Health Race Equity Month event, Leadership Development for Academics. I'm James Hallwood. I'm Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Council of Deans of Health, and I'm going to be facilitating this session, but fundamentally, more than most, kind of looking forward to listening and learning from this session as well. So before we kick off, I thought I'd just offer a few thoughts about housekeeping, just to kind of let you know how we're doing this. So this event is being recorded. I think it will just be the start of the event that we use, but the start of the event will hopefully be a useful resource for members that aren't able to make it, and for others that would like to learn more about this topic. Your cameras can come on and your microphones can come on. It's slightly different to some of the other council events we have, because this isn't just a kind of a webinar with a presentation, it's a workshop as well. So we're going to start just with some opening questions from me that will hopefully kind of get us thinking about the subject. Then if we have some time, we'll go to some immediate questions and answers. We'll see how timing goes on that, but we've got then the workshop format where you'll go into breakout rooms and look at a question that we will give to you. And then we'll come back. If someone from each of the breakout rooms can offer their thoughts, we can then record that, put that together as kind of some of the work that we've got from your feedback. And then we'll return to our speakers and some final kind of questions as well off the back of that, and then just some closing remarks. So thank you so much for joining us for this. Hopefully it proves to be a useful session. And like I said, it's more interactive than the sessions we'd normally do, but I think it'll be really useful because I think we've got a lot to learn from everyone that's attending. So thank you. So to the topic at hand, I'm really delighted to welcome two excellent speakers who are perfectly qualified to discuss the subject of leadership development for academics. We've got Dr. Gurnam Singh, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick and a Visiting Fellow in Race and Education at the University of the Arts London. And we've also got Dr. Melissa Jogie, Senior Lecturer at the School of Education and a Research Culture Lead at Roehampton University, as well as Director of the Diversifying Leadership Programme at Advanced HE as well. So delighted to have them with us. And I thought what we could do just to kind of start to get the discussion going is just kick off with maybe an initial question on what we think, would kind of facilitate the discussion that we've got. So I suppose the first question that comes to mind for me is, how do we encourage more opportunities for those who are keen to develop in academia but are struggling to develop in their careers? So I wonder if there's some initial thoughts from Gurnam and then maybe Melissa on that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because, in a sense, we don't want to discourage them, but we also need to make them aware of some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges as well. In fact, I've just shared a paper that I worked on a few years ago, which was commissioned by the Leadership Foundation in Higher Education, and we kind of really confronted that question, which was, how can we make, not break, leaders in higher education? Kind of what we were arguing was that there are some, pathways through. We talk about the glass ceiling, breaking the glass ceiling, but there are dizzy heights up there, and you fall just as hard. So there's a sense of the rise and fall, which probably reveals something much more systematic and structural in the kind of system. So we can certainly make individual acts of support, of allyship, and all the kind of language that we've got. We can do that, and we should do that. That's what a good colleague is. It's somebody who helps and nurtures and helps others to develop. Yeah, I mean, and there's no loss in that. I think sometimes in organizations, we might be a bit short-sighted if we think that by somehow enabling others to kind of advance, that's going to restrict our chances, or it's going to kind of damage our prospects. That's one of the biggest false kind of misperceptions, I think, in leadership, if that's still around. And even that there might be this fear, oh, well, if I allow my colleague to do well, then who's going to replace them? This sense that somehow, or they might kind of go somewhere else because they've kind of developed. I think you should take pride in the fact that people develop in your organizations, and definitely Black and minority colleagues, and we should be ashamed if they don't. So there's a sense of how we respond emotionally to that as colleagues. But things are improving. In the last kind of 2 years, I've seen this kind of whole crop of Black leaders, particularly at the kind of senior level. But my concern is that most of them are still in these kind of specialist diversity posts, yeah? And in fact, the research that we did, we actually looked at the US, because in the US, they tend to do things 10 years, 15 years ahead of us, yeah? And so, you know, there were similar questions being raised in the 70s and 80s around Black leadership in higher education. And the same stuff, those that were enabled to advance in higher education were often through specialist schemes with very specific roles around equity and race, as if that's all they were qualified to kind of comment on. But the downside of that was that they then became pigeonholed, they became stereotyped, they became seen as threats and as inadequate. So in some senses, occupying a specialist position might enable you to advance yourself, but there's a downside to that, because then you're kind of packaged in one way, and that's not good for a career. You need to be seen to have a wider skill set. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but I kind of suppose I'm just kind of talking around some of the issues. Yeah.
No, it's really, really useful to think about that. And actually, I think you're right. You kind of speak to an attitude that I think sometimes everyone at some stage in their life has maybe had as well, when it's that sense of wanting success for people, but then being concerned about other people moving on or thinking about your own development. And it really is about that, realizing the strength in a network as well, I suppose, that when everyone kind of rises up together, then hopefully you can look out for each other and then think about the next generation of people that also need that that assistance too. And then I'll hand over to you now, Melissa, but I thought it really struck me as well, the idea of pigeonholing people so that actually you feel like it's a tick box exercise where you say, well, you know, you are qualified to talk about this one particular issue, and actually success to me across this agenda looks like people from a range of backgrounds across all different academic careers, rather than feeling like it can only be one avenue. But the work that's being done here is really crucial. So Melissa, do you want to share your thoughts?
Sure, thank you, James, and thanks, Gurnam. That's a really good way of putting it. I think to help, the way that I think about it is that we are stuck philosophically between leadership as a structural organizational unit, and then you have the individuals on the end of that spectrum who aspire to have the characteristics and the qualities and the opportunities to become the best that they can be. And I think somewhere between, particularly in higher education, across all disciplines, really, there is a lot of opaqueness, where there is a kind of sacrificial duty of yourself in many ways to climb that ladder. And you find that, you know, down at the student level of you delivering your basic, maybe the most inspirational things that made you want to get in academia to begin with, often gets, you know, tainted, because the higher up you go on the spectrum of higher education, the more metrics you see and the more statistics people can be collapsed into. So when we talk about giving opportunities, I do believe that we have to change our mindsets. And by that, I mean, we inherit a lot of the structural organizational processes that are before us. But coming into the field, particularly Black and minority ethnic leaders, is this deficit thinking that I already do not have, I already am at a disadvantage. So you have to support colleagues to get out of that mindset in order to shift from the I can't to I can. And I think these are the primary steps that need to be seeded consistently at middle level management, before you can broach those opportunities going further. So I do think that, you know, will we ever get to a point of ideal leadership representation on the senior end of things? I just don't think that it's possible, because that's a completely different game. But the journey from where you start can certainly be one that's a lot less traumatic and a lot less painful for people having to go through those experiences. And as Gurnam said, you know, you want to be proud of being able to nurture those opportunities and make those differences.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And look, I suppose I kicked off with something which is hopefully a bit more optimistic, focusing on how we can kind of look at those opportunities. But I suppose, you know, you both touched on this, and maybe Melissa, if we could go to you to kick off on this one again. I suppose, where are the key barriers? What does need to be overcome? You touched on it a bit there, but I'm thinking everything from the kind of the macro level, I suppose, to the micro level. That what stops, what inhibits, what holds back progress in this area.
That's a really good point, and I'd give you, like, there are many ways you can summarize some of those barriers, but I'll give you maybe some of the top ones that come to mind that aren't as obvious. Certainly, I found that working through Advanced HE, people who aspire to leadership and come from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds do not seem to fully embrace their cultural wealth that they bring with them to an organization. That cultural background and that cultural value and wealth seems to be something that is almost put aside in order to put on the blinders about what are the prerequisites that I need to achieve XYZ towards promotion or XYZ task towards leadership. And the work that we largely do is around recognizing how your family's history of valuing education or valuing integrity, or wherever you come from, having that connection with people, all seem to touch on the points of inspiring belonging, inspiring strength, resilience. So why isn't some of that being showcased more prominently in your workspace? So I think that is one significant reappreciation that we need to focus on. A second thing as well is definitely being able to advocate a little bit more clearly the steps. So playing the political game that we like to call it, but knowing how the UK as a higher education system and academia, how does it work? It's not necessarily the same. So when I did my postgraduate training, I did everything in Australia, and then I had this brilliant idea to come to the UK. So I left all of my, you know, wealth that I had accumulated about understanding institutions and organizations to come here and start all over again, where suddenly I realized, oh, I am BAME. I felt like I inherited an oppression that I never felt before living in other countries. So this was new, and this was quite shocking for me here, and to grapple with what that meant for people who were expressing these concerns. So I think understanding, you know, your institution's legacy and its culture is essential.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Melissa. And I'm seeing some questions coming up in the chat. So just to reassure audience members that if we have time, we'll ask them before the breakout session. But if not, we will get to them a bit later on as well. So please do keep them coming in, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them as well. So that was really eloquently put. Thanks, Melissa. Gurnam, I suppose just your thoughts then about where those barriers are. You kind of touched on the opportunities, but it's the barriers now I think we need to look at.
Yeah, and I'm going to come at this from a kind of personal experience, really. Having spent 30 years in higher education, and in some sense, it faced a lot of those barriers, but overcome some of those as well, navigated some of those as well. See, one of the issues I found is that if you're kind of Black or brown, call it what, I don't know what the language is nowadays, yeah, BAME or whatever. If you're positioned as non-white or the other to whiteness within higher education institutions, within the kind of faculty, really, I'm not talking about students because I think we've got quite a diverse student body. You're positioned as other, yeah? And there's a whole lot of things that happen as a result of that. There are some nice things that happen that as other you can be celebrated, yeah? In fact, that's often what happens, is the sole Black manager or senior person then becomes kind of a celebrity. The downside is that being positioned as the other is that you get subject to intense levels of surveillance. And the consequence of that is, the good thing is that you might be your achievements might be celebrated, but the downside is that if you make any mistakes or any indiscretions, that they might then be used to undermine you. And there's actually a whole litany. There's a whole kind of very celebrated cases of Black people who have gone quite high in corporations, but also in universities, who have then fallen down and almost been scandalized. Yeah. And of course, the impact that has is that then just frightens everybody else. Is it worth it? Do I need the hassle, etc., etc.? So one of the lessons I've learned is, another thing is how you overcome that is, and you become this kind of superhero. And again, we all want to be superheroes, but can we all be superheroes? Yeah. And there's a danger of burnout, and there's a danger of then self-harm. And again, how do we deal with all these things? Some of it's to do with the nature of, I think, management, leadership in higher education. I think it's a pretty tough task. But some of it's the way in which we see Black people or brown people as only as special people, not as normal, ordinary people. And the point at which we can have a non-white face as an ordinary member of staff who can achieve and not do extraordinary things, that's when we maybe have got to that, because that takes the pressure off those colleagues. Doesn't mean that you can't achieve, but it takes the pressure off them. So that's one of the things that I've found is around surveillance. The other one is that in some senses we have to avoid being part of a numbers game. Melissa talked about playing the game. My concern with the game is, and there's lots of literature in game theory about this, is that the rules of the game are stacked against certain people. So by playing the game, you're always going to lose. It's kind of heads I win, tails you lose. So I think that those who are in charge of designing the game, or maybe in charge of the institutional, the organizational structures, processes, need to be thinking about how we can redesign that game that isn't stacked against those people, because that's kind of what happens. So it's a complex kind of problem. And I've been doing a lot of kind of work around complexity and how we deal with complex challenges. And it's not just bringing in those faces that may well be the solution. That might actually be the problem. It might set you back. What you need to do is we need to be able to change the way in which Melissa again talked about our mindsets, didn't you? You talked about the mindset. And in complexity theory, it says the only way we can really kind of deal with these complex problems is by changing our mindsets. So, how do BAME, Black, Brown people see themselves? Melissa says before she came to the UK, she didn't even see herself as a BAME. And now we've become BA. I'm a BAME. What's BAME? I don't know. But we talk, our BAME colleagues, our BAME staff, our BAME manager. Well, what does that just reveals the fact that we've turned complex individuals into a category, and we judge them as a category. So we've got to almost use the language of race and equity. It's a bit like a Wittgensteinian problem. The language itself limits what we want to achieve. So it's a bit like, I think in Wittgenstein it says, it's like we need the language. It's like it's like a ladder, a step ladder to somewhere else. But once you get there, you have to burn the ladder. You have to get rid of the ladder. Otherwise, you come tumbling back down. So I can leave it there.
That was really interesting. And actually, a couple of things that really jumped out at me on that as well. I suppose one was just making me think about very well-meaning kind of mindset, but actually that does other people, which is that focus on kind of someone being inspirational. And some people are very inspirational, but I'm conscious, I've got a background in doing some work around disability. And there are lots of disabled people that were saying, I'm just going to work. There are some really inspirational disabled people, but actually I don't need a pat on the back for that stuff. I don't need to be held up. I'm just doing what I should just be able to do. And again, some people that I think maybe a harder conversation, because it's people that really mean the best, but sometimes it does, as you say, kind of go in and almost put the spotlight on them one way or the other, which is really interesting. You touched on something which I thought would be interesting maybe for both of you to kind of reflect on, because obviously the whole debate about terminology and stuff like that, you know, I feel like it changes round, and you know, new terms come in and go out. But I suppose when we're thinking about you know, people from, say, like black and brown backgrounds, minority backgrounds, minoritized backgrounds, however we want to kind of word it, is there that risk that we conflate a huge number of different individuals, different cultural backgrounds, different groups together, and that within that we can kind of miss either specific challenges, specific outcome differences, and what's the way to kind of traverse that? So I suppose to use your language, and what's the way to kind of use that initial ladder, and then what's that next stage of then realizing it's a lot more complex than effectively, for want of a better term, a non-white category that then misses out all the nuances between different communities, let alone individuals, which is crucial. I don't know, Melissa, if you wanted to kind of kick off some thoughts on that.
I was going to present a counterpoint to what you just said, right? So if we were to think for a minute of categorizing all people as white in that category, it would, and treat all of the policies that we make and all of the decisions just under that one box of white, you might find that, yes, there might be some sort of homogenization, but the research has shown that, you know, Black males are actually maybe less disadvantaged than white working class males. So, well, boys, and this is in the scholarship of laddish culture. So you start to question yourself, you know, even by racial categorization, you have to bring in so many more dimensions to understand, even to try and get a group feature around, or group definition, whether your socioeconomic background, you know, where you were raised, what's your nationality. There's a lot in there that is horribly collapsed into BAME. And the term has, you know, caused a lot of issues because, again, I do appreciate that we can't have consensus forms, and God forbid, you know, that tick every single intersectional background that we can possibly have. So there is merit in terms of clustering our categorizations. However, when we act solely on the recommendations for those categorizations, we run into trouble. We need to appreciate that it is a category, but within that category, there is complexity. And that complexity has to be understood and attended to diligently. And this is the whole body of work with equality, diversity, and inclusion. When we put together interventions, many of them don't necessarily work. In fact, quite a few of them unintentionally cause hidden harms, because we are targeting specific things to do and they just do not work. In fact, they ostracize particular groups even further. So I think there is a wicked kind of balance that we have to contend with, but it's the people who project those findings that need to be really careful and diligent to what they're saying.
That was really useful. Thank you, Melissa. I think it's really excellent explanation for how you kind of traverse that, the macro and the micro, and that the differences between where it's useful and actually where it can hold back as well in terms of delivery. So that's really useful. Thank you. Gurnam, I don't know if you had some thoughts further to that.
I agree with Melissa. I think, okay, the category that was deployed by anti-racists in the UK, I mean, I think it's different. And to some extent, we kind of borrowed off the US here, around the 60s and 70s, was black. And that was because it was always seen as a political category and not a cultural category. It wasn't about ethnic identity. It was about a collective experience of white oppression, of whiteness, manifested through coloniality and through enslavement and those kind of things, and capitalist accumulation. Yeah. So that was the way into those debates. But what happens around the kind of 80s, and if you remember, that's when Margaret Thatcher comes in, the Conservatives come in. I'm making that reference because, in a sense, we're at a similar kind of juncture now. We've got a very diverse. We've got a non-white leader in our country now. What does that mean? Yeah, we've got a Home Secretary who wants to deport black, brown refugees and asylum seekers. It says two things: that we need to be wary about defining defining people's merits in terms of cultural or ethnic identity. Yeah, it's not to say that doesn't make up our humanity, but we shouldn't be appointing people into leadership roles or any of because of their cultural or ethnic identity. That seems to be absurd. You appoint them because they're the best person for the job, and they can contribute to the cultural capital, if you like, of the organization in positive ways. Yeah, that's certainly an argument for diversity of experience. But you can have diversity of experience in many ways, and as Melissa said, the kind of intersectional questions come in there as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that we need to know what the categories are for, how we deploy them. But definitely we can't talk about inequity unless we have some kind of baseline data, unless we have some kind of way of saying there is inequity here. Yeah, how do you do that? I mean, James, you talked about disabled people. I mean, the way in which disabled people have confronted the definitions, the medical model, the social administration model, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is an ongoing struggle. That's why I said it's a kind of Wittgensteinian problem, because we can't do with language and we can't do without language in a sense. It's but I suppose one way to do it is say that, again, I'm coming from more of a kind of Foucauldian perspective here, is that we have to avoid the language of performativity. We have to avoid performing in inclusivity, performing diversity. And that's often done by these kind of glossy, symbolic kind of repertoires, and making it something that becomes normal, becomes everyday. I mean, and that way, then we don't need to perform blackness or whiteness or anything else. Yeah, there's a sense that the category can be empowering, but only to a certain degree. Ultimately, the category itself becomes the thing that holds us back, whether we think of ourselves as white or non-white or whatever. And so that's the challenge. I'm not sure we're going to get out of that challenge, but I've seen say, white managers, white leaders who have accepted whiteness as a kind of as something that's a historically kind of determined and something that needs to be struggled in, but they haven't become a hostage to whiteness. Yeah. So we shouldn't be a hostage to these concepts, these identities that are there for a purpose. They're not there to define our being. Sorry for a slightly philosophical response. I think unless it's giving all the practical kind of sense.
Well, look, I mean, it's perfect, because I find it really useful actually to think about that, because I think there is always the risk with things that you make the perfect the enemy of the good, don't you? So if you can't get to the ideal stage, then you either kind of give up, or officially, or you kind of almost give up internally a bit and think, well, we're never going to get there. And actually, there's a liberation, I think, in what you were saying around language, actually, which is just that sense of it's never going to be entirely perfect. And it's kind of what you were almost saying as well, Melissa. It can be clunky, it can be difficult. We can't just kind of think job done using a term and then never interrogate it again and revisit it. But actually, we can't do without terms either, one way or the other, even if they're imperfect. And so kind of acknowledging that's really useful stage of it as well. So to quickly look through the chat, so I can see that there are kind of a variety of comments, and so hopefully they're a useful resource for people who are joining as well, because I've seen that there's some shared kind of links and things like that. Please, people, do feel free, if you want to start putting some questions in, we can look to get them answered a bit later on as well. It just struck me on something that both of you said, but I'm thinking, Melissa, particularly with your work at Advanced HE, we could spend, we could have a whole day conference on the intersections here, but something you said around class I thought was really interesting, and socioeconomic background, because that to me feels like a really obvious intersection in terms of the differences when it comes to outcomes, the differences when it comes to people being aware of opportunities and traversing obstacles as well. And I just wondered if both of you really had some thoughts about that, and if you think there are any other kind of really obvious intersections that should jump out. But to me, class always feels like an interesting one when we look at outcomes.
Well, that is certainly interesting, and I think you can build the history of this nation on the back of class, because it's the one thing we keep coming back to, regardless of the discipline. And I think with the work with Advanced HE, now this is not a product plug placement, but we do work with academics who aspire to leadership. And what's unique about the program is that we link these academics who are ready for leadership, so they have to apply and show that they are primed for it, with senior leadership at their institution. And we do a sponsorship program. And within that sponsorship program, you get a lot of understanding of how to navigate your way into a leadership role, where someone, which is, it's different from mentorship, because someone in sponsorship advocates for you and champions your strengths when you're not in the room, and a mentor will be someone who will tell you what you maybe need to do. The sponsorship program is definitely different. And I think when it comes to socioeconomic backgrounds, I have found very simply, trying to understand where someone else comes from is a significant step to understanding how their values are shaped, and how they may even have their biases, and what informs the way that they might think about certain decisions being made. So how many of us have really had a conversation with our colleagues about how they were raised, or, you know, could you eat chicken every single day of the week, or was it only a Sunday meal? Or, you know, I had a conversation with a colleague the other day who told me how much money they made when they were 16, or how they had to put themselves through uni. And you start to see a side of understanding where people come from. And it was humbling to appreciate how far people have come along. And looking at that very Bourdieuian kind of concepts of cultural capital, and that social capital. I mean, if anything, you know, we advocate that in the UK, we champion an equality of opportunity to give everyone a chance. And maybe to some extent, that has been true. You are entitled to many opportunities to at least knock on the door. But as Gurnam was saying, you know, sometimes they work against individuals depending on how they are structured. But I do think that the chance is there, at least for many. And when it comes to the socioeconomic backgrounds, I think a lot of work has been done to try and stop that from being a barrier, but we can't stop that entirely, because it's so linked to our own capital and our own understanding of what it takes to get from A to B. So there is some complexity there, but Gurnam might have some points to add.
Yeah, I mean, some fantastic points. And I'll just pick up on that point around cultural capital. But, I mean, we all possess capital. We all, I mean, people without any qualifications accumulate all kinds. And there's Yosso's work on there is really important around community cultural capital. That you know, people are empty vessels. So the question is, why do we value certain forms of capital and not other forms of capital? Yeah. We talk about the issue around class. We will value an Oxbridge kind of London centric dialect, for example, and if you have a dialect that is not there, that kind of gives all kinds of meanings that are put onto that. You find that in Scotland. I'm going to be giving a keynote up in St Andrews, and if you look at the west of Scotland and the east, there's a huge kind of difference of the east of Scotland, is seen as a kind of cultured Scottish dialect, whereas the west of Scotland is seen as more towards Ireland kind of thing. And we know about the stereotyping around Irish migrants. So we do need to think about the impact that those things have. So how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with the way in which certain forms of behavior seem to carry more weight, they carry more currency. And I've made an argument in some stuff that I've been doing. I said, we need to begin to start to divest in white cultural capital. Yeah, we all need to divest in that, because if we don't divest in that, then we won't be able to put value on other forms of cultural capital and divesting in whiteness. Now, some people might think, well, isn't that threatening to white people? And I'm saying that actually whiteness is nothing to do with white people. Whiteness simply positions people, and it enables some people to take advantage of that. But like white working class, you know, so if whiteness in a kind of idealized whiteness is constructed around a particular posh accent, then white working class people can be positioned outside of that space, yeah, or certain behaviors. In fact, you know, they used to say that white working class people were referred as the great unwashed. Yeah, kind of, if you come across this term, the great unwashed. These were people who were dirty white people. Yeah, and I think the same thing kind of operates around cultural capital. So, in some senses, by divesting in forms of privilege, because that's what white cultural capital is, forms of privilege or privileging, potentially liberates us all, yet we can't see that. You know, it's not as if whiteness is a model equivalent to blackness. Yeah, whiteness is the basis upon which racist ideology is constructed. Without whiteness, there'd be no racist ideology. Yeah, in fact, whiteness gives birth to blackness itself. If we could get rid of whiteness by getting rid of blackness, I'd be the first one to vote for get rid of blackness. Yeah, it's coming back to that kind of sense of category. So I've done some work on this around the role of white allies. Yeah, this idea that how can white people use their power to, I don't know, to get rid of their power? That's kind of what it is, and that's kind of like a paradox. But I do say that if you want to avoid being a performative ally, and performative allyship is where you're holding on to power and privilege, but you're trying to say, I'm going to do something for you. It's a bit like these kind of benevolent models of development in development studies, where we want all our Western privileges, but we're happy to build some wells in Malawi or whatever. Yeah. But there's another kind of white allyship, which is non-performative. And I've talked about this. So that's where you're actively divesting in histories, systems, and structures that reproduce racism, that you're sharing power, privilege, risk, and vulnerability. For me, you know, how do you do that? How can you share risk and vulnerability with your Black colleagues? Because that's the kind of thing that's going to build a genuine relationship. And I'm not saying this from the abstract. And I've said this often. I don't think I would have been able to get to where I am in higher education without a whole string of white allies who have shared risk, vulnerability, and privilege with me. Yeah, so there have been true white allies. So it's possible to be a white ally, but we do have to take those risks. It's not a risk-free enterprise.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, look, that feels like a really good place for us to then go over to the audience and the workshops that we're going to have. I say audience, but really we're kind of expecting you all to kind of pitch in and give your thoughts as well. So if there are questions, please do put them in the chat, but I think what we'll do is we'll come back to them once we do feedback after these sessions. So what's going to happen is people are going to go into breakout groups. If you could find someone there that could feedback, that would be fantastic. And then maybe what I'd suggest is if you put the name of the person in the chat, that way I know kind of who to call for, or, you know, I'm sure we'll find a way. But I'm going to put the theme of the discussion in the chat now, and I'll just read this out so it's there for everyone. So what's the top 3 things that HEIs could do to better support the career development of minoritised academics in healthcare education? So there's top 3 things, and it's worth saying that the reason why we've done a workshop on this, it's not just because it's really, you know, it's nice to kind of have a space to share and to discuss, but we've got members of the policy team kind of dialed into this. Obviously, I head up the policy work of the council, and actually everything that we hear from you will be really useful in terms of informing the work that we do, informing the work of the EDI strategic policy group that we have, I know that we have our anti-racism group as well, and others that are kind of involved